Charlotte Monroe entered the courtroom late, dressed like she was heading to a gala instead of a legal hearing. I was there, sitting quietly on one of those hard benches, waiting for my turn in an unrelated case. The whole room shifted when she walked in. Heads turned, conversations hushed, and even the judge, the ever-serious Nathaniel Brooks, glanced up sharply. You don't forget a woman like her. Not the kind who strides in unapologetically late, wearing a crimson designer suit and heels that probably cost more than my car. Charlotte wasn't just late. She was loud in her presence. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor as she approached her seat, her diamond earrings catching the overhead lights, her perfume reaching the back row before she did. Her phone buzzed once, breaking the silence, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop as Judge Brooks' jaw tightened. He didn't speak immediately, letting the tension grow. That man has a gift for making silence feel like punishment. When the judge finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 reprimands. Ms. Monroe, this is a courtroom, not a fashion show. Charlotte didn't flinch. She just smiled, the kind of smile that makes you feel like she knows something you don't. I apologize, Your Honor. Traffic in the city is impossible. The way she said it, like she wasn't sorry at all, made me wince. Judge Brooks didn't look amused. He leaned forward, glaring at her with the kind of authority only years on the bench can build. Let's get one thing straight, he said. You will respect these proceedings, or you'll find yourself in contempt. Am I clear? Charlotte gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and leaned back in her chair like she owned the place. The arrogance of it all was something to behold. I sat there, watching the drama unfold, barely able to believe it. When the prosecutor began his questioning, Charlotte rose and made her way to the stand, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She crossed her legs as she sat, the bright red soles of her shoes flashing for everyone to see. Ms. Monroe, the prosecutor started, his tone sharp. You've been accused of siphoning funds from your charitable foundation. Can you explain these transactions? He slid a pile of documents across the table. Charlotte glanced at the papers, but didn't bother picking them up. I don't handle the details, she said. That's what my accountants are for. The prosecutor's eyebrow twitched. So, you're claiming ignorance? I'm claiming delegation, she shot back, her tone dripping with condescension. It was almost painful to watch. Every question was met with the same air of indifference. The prosecutor laid out evidence, emails, bank statements, testimonies from former employees. Each time, Charlotte dismissed it with an excuse or a nonchalant shrug. I wasn't sure if she was brilliant or just reckless. Maybe both. Then, Teresa Johnson took the stand. She was an older woman, composed but visibly nervous. She worked for Charlotte once, and her story wasn't flattering. She treated us like we were beneath her, Teresa said, her voice shaking. One time, during an argument, she called me a maid. She said I should know my place. The air went still. For a moment, nobody moved. Charlotte didn't deny it outright, but her response was worse. I don't recall saying that, she said casually, then added with a smirk. And if I did, it was probably a joke. A murmur ran through the gallery. Even Judge Brooks' gavel couldn't silence the growing whispers of outrage. And then the prosecutor produced the tape. The recording was grainy but clear. Charlotte's voice came through, unmistakable, laced with contempt. The room erupted. People whispered, gasped, shook their heads. The judge had to bang his gavel 3 times before order was restored. That was the moment Charlotte's facade cracked. Just for a second, her confidence faltered. She glanced at her lawyer, who was busy flipping through papers like he could find an escape route hidden in the fine print. The damage was done. When the hearing adjourned, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Protesters gathered outside, shouting slogans and holding signs. Reporters swarmed, microphones aimed at anyone who looked like they might know something. I slipped out quietly, but not before catching a final glimpse of Charlotte. She was surrounded by her legal team, her phone in hand, texting furiously. For the first time all day, she looked rattled. As I left, I couldn't shake the image of her sitting there, so sure of herself, only to have it all come crashing down. Part of me felt bad for her. How could anyone live under so much pressure and still hold their head high? But another part of me couldn't help but feel she had it coming. Sometimes, arrogance meets its match, and when it does, the fall is spectacular. Charlotte Monroe was unraveling before everyone's eyes. During the hearing, her arrogance bubbled over into outright defiance. She interrupted Judge Nathaniel Brooks multiple times, her voice carrying over his gavel like she was holding court, not attending it. The tension in the room was palpable, every word she spoke tightening the invisible cord around her neck. The judge's glares were icy daggers, but she was too wrapped up in her own hubris to notice or care. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is becoming absurd," she said, cutting off the prosecutor mid-sentence. Her tone dripped with sarcasm, and the smirk on her face wasn't helping her case. The judge's gavel slammed down hard. "Ms. Monroe, you are skating on very thin ice. Another outburst like that, and I will hold you in contempt." Charlotte rolled her eyes, a dramatic, sweeping gesture that sent a ripple of murmurs through the gallery. "I'm just saying, some of these accusations are downright laughable," she said, leaning back in her chair and crossing her legs. Her lawyer, a sharp-suited man who had clearly been through enough battles to know when he was losing, leaned in and whispered urgently, "Charlotte, for God's sake, stop talking." She waved him off like a pesky fly. "I've got this," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The cracks began to show. Teresa Johnson was called back to the stand, and the room fell silent as she made her way forward. Teresa's calm dignity was a stark contrast to Charlotte's theatrics. This wasn't just a case for her. It was a reckoning. The courtroom leaned in as Teresa described her time working for Charlotte, a time marked by humiliation, racial slurs, and an endless stream of microaggressions that left her questioning her worth. "She called me lazy when I asked for a day off to attend my daughter's school play," Teresa said, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. She said, "People like you don't get to have luxuries like family time." Charlotte snorted loudly from her seat, drawing shocked gasps from the audience. "Oh, please," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's exaggerating." Judge Brooks' voice boomed. "Ms. Monroe, you will not interrupt this witness again. Is that understood?" Charlotte crossed her arms, her face a mask of insolence. "Crystal clear," she replied, her tone thick with mockery. "Be why now?" Even her own lawyer was struggling to keep his composure. "Charlotte, stop it," he hissed through gritted teeth. "You're digging yourself a deeper hole." She ignored him, her focus on Teresa, who continued undeterred. "She once told me that people like me should be grateful for scraps. She made me feel like less than a person." The prosecutor turned to Teresa, his voice low and empathetic. "When you say people like you, what do you mean?" Teresa hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Black people," she said firmly. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Charlotte scoffed, leaning back in her chair as if this whole thing was a waste of her time. "Oh, give me a break," she said. "Now I'm a racist? This is ridiculous." The judge's gavel struck again, louder this time. "Ms. Monroe, I am warning you. This is your last chance. Any further disruptions, and you'll be removed from this courtroom." But Charlotte couldn't stop herself. She muttered something under her breath, and while it wasn't clear to everyone what she said, the judge's face darkened. The prosecutor wasn't about to let this moment slip. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, holding up a tablet. "We have another piece of evidence that we believe is critical to this case." Judge Brooks nodded curtly. "Proceed." The prosecutor played a video recording. It showed Charlotte berating Teresa during a staff meeting. The words lazy and incompetent were thrown around liberally, but the real bombshell came at the end. "If you can't handle the pressure," Charlotte sneered in the recording, "maybe you should go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." The room erupted. People whispered, gasped, shook their heads in disbelief. Charlotte's lawyer buried his face in his hands. Even Judge Brooks looked taken aback for a moment before regaining his composure. Charlotte, however, remained defiant. "That video is taken out of context," she shouted, standing up from her chair. "This is a smear campaign." The judge's voice thundered over hers. "Ms. Monroe, sit down." Bailiff, remove her from the courtroom if she does not comply. For a moment, it seemed like Charlotte might fight back, but the bailiff took a step forward, and she reluctantly sank back into her seat, muttering under her breath as the hearing neared its end. It was clear that Charlotte's bravado had done more harm than good. The prosecutor's closing remarks were devastating. "This is not just a case about financial misconduct," he said. "It is about a pattern of abuse, entitlement, and exploitation. Ms. Monroe has shown time and time again that she believes the rules do not apply to her." Judge Brooks leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments," he said, his voice heavy with finality. Charlotte stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. Reporters swarmed her, microphones thrust in her face, but she pushed through them, her head held high despite the weight of what had just transpired. I watched her go, unable to look away. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, horrible, yet impossible to ignore. Behind her, Teresa stood with quiet dignity, her testimony still echoing in the room. As I left the courtroom, I couldn't help but think about how people like Charlotte always seemed untouchable, until they weren't. And when they fell hard. The courtroom was already charged when Judge Nathaniel Brooks turned to the next witness. His expression was one of barely contained exasperation as he introduced Mr. James Harris, a 67-year-old retired teacher. Dressed in a modest gray suit, Mr. Harris stood out sharply against Charlotte Monroe's high-fashion arrogance. His face bore the weariness of someone who had carried more than his share of life's burdens. "Mr. Harris," Judge Brooks said, his tone firm but respectful, "please explain to the court your encounter with Ms. Monroe." James Harris took a deep breath, his weathered hands gripping the sides of the podium as he began. "It happened 3 months ago," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I was crossing the street near 5th and Lexington, using the crosswalk like any pedestrian should." Charlotte shifted in her chair, rolling her eyes so dramatically it drew gasps from the gallery. Judge Brooks shot her a warning glare, but she only smirked and leaned back, feigning boredom. Harris continued, undeterred. "As I was halfway across, I heard the roar of an engine. I looked up and saw a black sports car barreling down the street, Ms. Monroe's car. I froze for a second, thinking she would slow down, but she didn't. Instead, she swerved around me at the last moment, so close that I stumbled and fell. I landed hard, and that's how I injured my wrist." He held up his arm, revealing a brace that wrapped around his wrist and forearm. The courtroom murmured, sympathy for the elderly man spreading among the audience. "Mr. Harris," the prosecutor interjected, "did Ms. Monroe stop to check on you?" Harris shook his head. "No, sir. She kept driving like nothing happened." Charlotte let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, come on," she muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't even touch him." The judge's gavel slammed down, echoing through the courtroom. "Ms. Monroe, you will remain silent unless addressed," he barked, his patience visibly wearing thin. But Charlotte, emboldened by her own audacity, didn't stop. "This is ridiculous," she said, gesturing toward Harris. "He's just looking for someone to blame. People like him always are." The room went silent. The phrase "people like him" hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mr. Harris stiffened, his jaw tightening. Judge Brooks' face darkened with fury. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice cold and deliberate, "do you care to clarify what you mean by people like him?" Charlotte faltered for a moment, clearly realizing she had crossed a line. But then her defiance returned, her chin lifting. "I meant older people," she said, her tone flippant. "They're always looking for someone to blame for their mistakes." The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Harris's calm demeanor cracked just slightly, his voice trembling with anger as he responded. "Mistakes? The only mistake I made was believing that someone like you would care about the harm you cause." The judge's glare shifted to Charlotte's lawyer, who looked as though he wanted to sink into the floor. "Counselor, control your client," Brooks snapped. The lawyer leaned toward Charlotte, whispering furiously, but she pulled away, rolling her eyes again. "This is all so overblown," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear Donamar. Harris squared his shoulders, his voice steadying. Your Honor, I've spent my entire life as a teacher, trying to make this world a little better. I've never seen someone so careless, so utterly unconcerned with the well-being of others. He turned to face Charlotte directly. You didn't even stop. Do you know how humiliating it was for me? Lying there on the pavement, struggling to get up, while people stared and whispered. You could have killed me. Charlotte smirked, crossing her arms. You're still here, aren't you? A collective gasp echoed through the room. Even her lawyer seemed stunned by her callousness. Judge Brooks slammed his gavel again, his voice thunderous. Ms. Monroe, that is enough. One more word, and you'll be escorted out. The prosecutor wasn't done. Your Honor, he said, turning to the bench, we have security footage of the incident. A large screen was wheeled into the courtroom, and the video began to play. The grainy footage showed Harris crossing the street, the sports car speeding toward him. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as the car narrowly missed him, his body jerking back before he fell to the ground. The car didn't stop. It sped off, the license plate clearly visible, Monroe 1. Charlotte's smirk vanished as the video played. The evidence was undeniable. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands, and the gallery buzzed with whispers. Judge Brooks let the tension hang for a moment before speaking. Ms. Monroe, he said, his voice deadly calm, do you still wish to claim this incident didn't occur? Charlotte's lips tightened into a thin line, but her arrogance wouldn't let her admit fault. It looks worse than it was, she muttered. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Harris, he said, his voice full of respect, thank you for your testimony. You may step down. Harris nodded and walked back to his seat, his back straight despite the weight of the moment. As the hearing continued, Charlotte's carefully constructed world of privilege and invincibility began to crumble. The tension in the room was thick, the audience hanging on every word as the prosecutor laid out the final pieces of his case. Charlotte, for all her bravado, looked smaller now. The humiliation she had tried so hard to deflect was finally catching up to her, and no amount of designer clothes or sharp retorts could save her from the storm she had created. Judge Brooks watched her with an expression that was part disgust, part pity. It was clear that he was ready to make an example of her, to show the world that even the untouchable could be brought down. And as I sat there, watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but think, justice, at long last, was being served. The courtroom was silent as Judge Nathaniel Brooks adjusted his glasses and stared at Charlotte Monroe, his face an unreadable mask of authority. The moment felt heavy, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the hammer to drop. Charlotte, seated with her legs crossed and arms folded, exuded an air of defiance despite the mountain of evidence against her. She looked as if she were above it all, untouchable. But today, that illusion was about to shatter. Ms. Monroe, Judge Brooks began, his voice firm and commanding. Your behavior throughout these proceedings has been nothing short of appalling. From your reckless actions to your blatant disregard for the lives and dignity of others, you've demonstrated a level of entitlement and arrogance that cannot go unchecked. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably, but the smirk she had worn so often during the trial was nowhere to be seen. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but she waved him off, her confidence waning as the judge's words bore down on her. You've endangered lives, shown a complete lack of remorse, and disrespected this court at every turn, Brooks continued, his tone icy. But this court is not only about punishment. It's about accountability and, where possible, rehabilitation. The judge leaned forward slightly, his steely gaze fixed on Charlotte. You are hereby ordered to pay a fine of $50,000 for your reckless endangerment and contempt. Additionally, you will perform 200 hours of community service and, for 1 month, you will work at the Harlem Community Center. There, you will assist individuals who have faced struggles far greater than your own and have had far fewer resources to overcome them. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Charlotte's eyes widened in disbelief. Excuse me, she blurted out, her voice rising in indignation. You want me to work there? Judge Brooks slammed his gavel down, silencing her outburst. You will remain silent, Ms. Monroe. This is not up for debate. The prosecutor nodded in approval, and even Charlotte's lawyer seemed relieved the sentence wasn't harsher. But Charlotte's reaction was anything but graceful. She leaned back in her chair, muttering under her breath, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You can't be serious," she hissed to her lawyer. "Community service? In Harlem? I don't belong there." Her words, though spoken softly, were overheard by James Harris, who sat nearby. The retired teacher turned to her, his voice calm but cutting. "Perhaps that's exactly why you need to go. Maybe it's time you learn what it's like to live without privilege for once." Charlotte glared at him, but his words seemed to hang in the air, a quiet condemnation that even she couldn't entirely ignore. As the sentence was announced, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and spectators exchanged glances of satisfaction. Outside, protesters who had gathered to demand justice for Teresa Johnson and others affected by Charlotte's actions cheered when they heard the news. Teresa herself, sitting in the gallery with quiet dignity, allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross her face. For her, this wasn't just about a fine or community service. It was about seeing someone who had wielded power carelessly finally held accountable. When the hearing adjourned, Charlotte tried to leave quickly, but the throng of reporters outside the courthouse had other plans. Microphones were thrust into her face, cameras flashing as questions bombarded her from every angle. "Ms. Monroe, how do you feel about your sentence? Do you think you can handle working in Harlem? Do you regret your actions?" Charlotte kept her head down, her lawyer pushing through the crowd, but the jeers from the protesters were impossible to ignore. Signs waved above the sea of people, reading, "Justice for Teresa," "Privilege isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card," and "Pay for your crimes, Charlotte." Her designer heels clicked against the pavement as she climbed into the back seat of a black SUV, the door slamming shut behind her. From the tinted window, I could see her face, pale, angry, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of something that looked like fear. Judge Brooks remained seated in the courtroom even after it emptied, his expression contemplative. He exchanged a brief nod with James Harris, who approached the bench. "Thank you for speaking up today," the judge said. "Your testimony made a difference." Harris nodded. "I just hope she learned something from all this." Teresa approached them as well, her voice quiet but resolute. "Do you think she will, Judge?" Brooks sighed. "That's up to her. But if she doesn't, I can promise you this. She'll be back in this courtroom, and next time, I won't be as lenient." As Charlotte's SUV disappeared down the street, the world buzzed with the fallout from the trial. Social media exploded with reactions, many celebrating the verdict, others skeptical that someone like Charlotte could ever truly change. Meanwhile, in Harlem, staff at the community center prepared for an unexpected new volunteer. Some welcomed the opportunity to show her a world she had ignored for too long, while others doubted she'd last a day. Either way, they knew one thing. Charlotte Monroe was about to get a crash course in humility, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived, but whether it would stick was a question only time could answer. Charlotte Monroe's voice pierced through the courtroom as she shot up from her chair, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor. "This is absurd. You can't make me do this," she shouted, her face a mixture of fury and disbelief. All eyes turned to her, the murmurs in the gallery growing louder as her outburst echoed through the chamber. Judge Nathaniel Brooks remained calm, his expression unyielding as he watched Charlotte unravel before him. He had seen plenty of defiance in his years on the bench, but there was something particularly grating about the entitlement that oozed from her every word. "Ms. Monroe," the judge said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife, "you will comply with this sentence, or I will have no choice but to impose even more severe consequences." Charlotte's mouth opened as if to argue, but the warning in Judge Brooks' tone made her hesitate. Her lawyer tugged at her arm, whispering urgently, but she wrenched it away, glaring at the judge with all the defiance she could muster. "This is a violation of my rights," she spat. "You're punishing me for being successful." The room erupted in whispers again, disbelief and disgust rippling through the audience. James Harris, seated quietly in the gallery, shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. It's not success they're punishing, Ms. Monroe, he said under his breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. It's your lack of humanity. Teresa Johnson, sitting a few rows ahead, didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. Her years of enduring Charlotte's cruelty seemed to culminate in this moment. Watching her former boss be held accountable for her actions in the most humiliating way possible, Judge Brooks didn't flinch under Charlotte's glare. Instead, he leaned forward, his calm demeanor only amplifying the authority in his voice. Ms. Monroe, he said, let me be absolutely clear. Failure to perform your community service or to show up for your duties at the Harlem Community Center will result in your incarceration. Do you understand? Charlotte's face turned red, her defiance briefly replaced by a flicker of panic. Incarceration? She repeated, her voice quieter now, but no less outraged. You can't be serious. The judge's gaze didn't waver. I assure you, Ms. Monroe, I am very serious. I suggest you think carefully about your next move. Her lawyer, clearly desperate to contain the situation, whispered to her again, this time more forcefully. Charlotte finally sank back into her chair, her face a storm of indignation and humiliation. The judge's words had landed. Whether she liked it or not, the reality of her situation was starting to set in. When the hearing concluded, Charlotte was met with a wall of reporters outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust into her face as questions came rapid fire. Ms. Monroe, do you feel the sentence was fair? Will you actually fulfill your community service? What do you say to the claims of racism and entitlement? Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line as her lawyer shielded her from the barrage, guiding her toward the waiting SUV. But as she climbed into the vehicle, one reporter's question cut through the chaos. Do you think you'll survive a month in Harlem? Her eyes flashed with something between anger and fear before she slammed the door shut. The SUV speeding away into the crowded city streets. The Harlem Community Center. Word of Charlotte's impending arrival spread quickly. Staff and volunteers were a mix of intrigued and skeptical. Most were familiar with her name from the headlines, and her reputation preceded her. She won't last a day, one volunteer said, shaking his head as he swept the floor. She's going to get a real education here, said another, a middle-aged woman sorting through donated clothes. Let's see how her designer shoes hold up when she's on her feet all day. The director of the center, a no-nonsense woman named Diane Willis, wasn't interested in the gossip. She'll do the work or she'll face the consequences, she said firmly. It's as simple as that. Charlotte's first day at the community center arrived, and it was everything she had dreaded. Gone were the comforts of her high-rise apartment and designer clothes. She was issued a plain polo shirt and jeans, both several sizes too large, and instructed to help organize supplies in the food pantry. The work was physically demanding and far beneath what she considered her station. She struggled to lift boxes, sneered at the dust on her hands, and complained loudly about the lack of air conditioning. This is inhumane, she muttered to no one in particular, though several volunteers overheard her. A young man named Marcus, who had been volunteering at the center for years, laughed openly. Inhumane, he repeated, shaking his head. Try growing up without enough to eat. Then we can talk about inhumane. Charlotte glared at him, but his words clearly struck a nerve. For the first time, she seemed to realize she was out of her depth. These weren't people who would cower before her wealth or status. Here, none of that mattered. As the day wore on, Charlotte's complaints became fewer, though her resentment was palpable. She avoided eye contact with the people she was supposed to be helping, her discomfort with their struggles obvious. Teresa Johnson, who had come to the center to observe, watched her former boss with a mix of satisfaction and pity. She has no idea what real life looks like, Teresa said quietly to James Harris, who had also stopped by. But maybe this will change that. Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. If she lets it. Charlotte's journey was only just beginning, and the road ahead promised to be as humbling as it was grueling. Whether she would learn anything from the experience, or remain trapped in her cocoon of privilege, was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain, the world was watching. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte Monroe couldn't buy her way out of the consequences. Charlotte Monroe's first day at the Harlem Community Center began with reluctant steps. The glamour of her former life was nowhere to be seen as she stood in the kitchen, wearing a plain apron over the ill-fitting clothes she'd been issued. Her manicure, once perfect, was now chipped, and her frustration simmered beneath the surface. She was assigned to help serve food and wash dishes, tasks she had likely never done before. The din of the dining hall was overwhelming, with the clatter of trays and the low hum of conversation. Charlotte stood behind the serving counter, her expression tight as she ladled soup into bowls for a long line of people. Many of them avoided eye contact, their weariness etched into their faces. Others offered polite nods or murmured, "Thank you," but Charlotte barely acknowledged them. To her, this was punishment, pure and simple, a far cry from the life she felt entitled to. As the day wore on, the discomfort in her back and the ache in her feet began to wear her down. She moved to the kitchen, where she was tasked with washing a seemingly endless stack of dishes. The hot water burned her hands, and the steam made her sweat, but she bit back her complaints, aware of the watchful eyes of the staff and volunteers. It was there, elbow-deep in soapy water, that she met Gloria, an older woman with a warm smile and a voice that carried the wisdom of years. Gloria had been volunteering at the center for over a decade and seemed to have a knack for putting people at ease. "You look like you're having a tough time," Gloria said, handing Charlotte another plate to rinse. Charlotte shot her a glance but said nothing, unwilling to admit her struggles. Gloria didn't seem to mind the silence. She simply kept working, her movements steady and practiced. After a moment, she spoke again, her tone reflective. "You know," she said, "we often forget that life can change in a moment. One day you think you've got it all figured out, and the next, it's all gone." Charlotte froze for a second, her hands still in the soapy water. The words hit her harder than she expected. She looked at Gloria, whose eyes were kind but piercing, as though she could see straight through Charlotte's carefully constructed facade. The days that followed were no easier, but something began to shift in Charlotte. Forced to confront the lives of the people she was serving, she started to see them not as strangers but as individuals with stories. Stories of loss, resilience, and survival. She met Marcus, the young man who had laughed at her complaints on her first day. He told her about growing up in the foster system, bouncing from home to home, and how the community center had been his sanctuary when he had nowhere else to go. She listened to a mother named Denise, who had fled an abusive relationship with her 2 young children and was now trying to rebuild her life from scratch. "You don't realize how strong you are," Denise told her, "until you've got no choice but to be strong." Each story chipped away at Charlotte's arrogance, replacing it with something she hadn't felt in years: compassion. She began to understand that the world wasn't divided into winners and losers, as she had once believed. Life was unpredictable, and privilege could vanish in an instant. By her 3rd week, Charlotte wasn't just fulfilling her duties. She was engaging with the people around her. She started asking questions, listening to their struggles and triumphs. The more she learned, the more her perspective changed. She even began to pitch in outside of her assigned tasks, helping with organizing donations and tutoring children in the after-school program. Gloria noticed the change and pulled Charlotte aside one afternoon. "You've come a long way," she said, her smile warm. "Don't let this be the end of it." Charlotte nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. For the first time, she realized she didn't want it to be. When Charlotte's month at the community center ended, it was bittersweet. She had grown to admire the staff and the volunteers, and the thought of leaving them behind felt strange. On her last day, the center held a small gathering to thank her for her service. Marcus handed her a card signed by the people she had worked with, and Denise gave her a hug, whispering, "Thank you for listening." Charlotte didn't know what to say. She simply smiled, her eyes damp with unshed tears. A week later, Charlotte returned to court to officially conclude her sentence. She walked into the courtroom with a very different energy than she had the first time. Gone was the defiance and entitlement that had marked her earlier appearances. Instead, she carried herself with quiet humility. Judge Brooks observed her closely as she stood before him. "Ms. Monroe," he said, "you've completed your sentence. Is there anything you'd like to say?" Charlotte took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady and sincere. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to thank you for giving me this chance. I didn't understand it at first, but the time I spent at the Harlem Community Center, it changed me. I've seen things I never saw before, and I've learned how much I took for granted. I want to do better. I will do better. The courtroom was silent as her words hung in the air. Judge Brooks nodded, his expression thoughtful. The real gratitude, he said, is in using the lessons you've learned to make a difference. It's up to you now, Ms. Monroe. Don't waste this opportunity. Charlotte nodded, her eyes meeting the judge's. I won't, she said quietly. As she left the courtroom, she caught sight of James Harris and Teresa Johnson in the gallery. Both of them nodded at her, their expressions unreadable but not unkind. It was a small moment, but it felt like a step towards something new. Charlotte's journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. The woman who had once sneered at the struggles of others had been replaced by someone who understood that life's value wasn't in wealth or status, but in connection and compassion. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. Charlotte Monroe was no longer the woman she used to be.